a 71-year-old woman in Havana gave away her soup last night. Not because she wanted to, because the power went out again and she knew it would spoil before it came back on. Her name is Mercedes Velasquez. She's lived through decades of hardship on that island, but she told reporters something that stopped me cold. She said, "We are here waiting to see what happens. 11 million people. Total darkness, third blackout in 4 months, no oil for over 3 months, surgeries postponed for tens of thousands of patients, and the President of the United States called Cuba a failed nation and said a deal was coming soon." Stay with me here, because this story is about a lot more than one island's power grid. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because the Cuba story did not begin with Monday's blackout. It began much earlier. And the thread that connects it to everything happening in the world right now is one that most coverage is not pulling on. Cuba has struggled with energy for decades. Its power grid is aging. Its economy has been squeezed by the U.S. embargo since 1962, over 60 years. But the island found a lifeline. Venezuela supplied Cuba with oil. That arrangement kept the lights on, kept hospitals running, kept food from spoiling in the heat. In late 2025, the United States militarily intervened in Venezuela. U.S. forces removed Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro from power, and as part of that intervention, the U.S. seized oil tankers that were headed to Cuba and declared a blockade on Venezuelan oil exports to the island. Here's the thing most people do not realize. That was not a side effect. That was the plan. Yeah, on January 29th, 2026, President Trump signed Executive Order 14,380. It declared a national emergency and authorized tariffs on any country that, and I want to be precise here, directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. Any country. Mexico's state-owned oil company, Pemex, was targeted. Any nation that tried to help Cuba get fuel was warned it would face economic punishment from the United States. The United Nations Human Rights Office called this a serious violation of international law. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he was, and this is a direct quote, extremely concerned about the humanitarian situation, warning it would worsen or even collapse if Cuba's oil needs were not met. But the blockade held. For 3 months, not a single significant oil shipment reached Cuba. 3 months. The island shifted to solar panels, natural gas, and aging thermoelectric plants that were never designed to carry the full load. Schools were closed, universities shut down, public transport was cut. Garbage began piling up in Havana because there was no fuel for the trash trucks. Surgeries, tens of thousands of them, were postponed because hospitals could not guarantee power. And then on March 16th, the entire electrical grid collapsed. A complete disconnection. Not a rolling blackout, not a regional outage. The entire island went dark simultaneously. The Ministry of Energy and Mines confirmed it. They said there were no failures in the units that were operating when the grid went down, meaning the grid did not fail because of a mechanical problem. It collapsed because there was simply not enough fuel left to keep it running. This was the third major island-wide blackout in 4 months. A 61-year-old Havana resident named Tomas David Velasquez Felipe told reporters that the relentless outages make him think that any Cuban who can leave should just go. "What little we have to eat spoils," he said. "Our people are too old to keep suffering. Follow the power. Follow the darkness." Because what happened in Cuba on Monday was not an accident. It was the predictable, documented, forewarned result of a deliberate U.S. policy. And here's what I want you to sit with before we go further. Cuba did not attack the United States. Cuba did not threaten U.S. ships or close a waterway. Cuba did not fire missiles at American bases. Cuba is a small island nation of 11 million people, 90 miles from Florida, with a military that cannot threaten anyone beyond its own shores. And yet it went completely dark because the United States cut off its oil supply. I want your honest reaction to that in the comments right now. When you hear that a government deliberately cuts off oil to an entire civilian population, including hospitals, schools, and food storage, what word comes to mind first? Drop it below. I want to see what you were thinking. Let me tell you what Monday night actually looked like for real people in Cuba. Mercedes Velasquez, 71 years old, gave away her soup because she knew the power would not come back in time to keep it cold. She told reporters she was waiting to see what happens. That sentence, waiting to see what happens, is the sentence of someone who has lost control over their own life. Someone who wakes up and has no idea whether there will be electricity, whether the food will last, or whether the hospital will be open if someone gets sick. Yamisel Sanchez Pena, 48, told reporters that the food she buys with money her son sends from the United States keeps spoiling. Her 72-year-old mother suffers through every blackout. Every day she suffers, she said. Tens of thousands of patients have had surgeries postponed. Think about what that means concretely. Someone scheduled for a cardiac procedure, someone with a tumor that needs to come out, someone whose hip has been deteriorating for months and who has been waiting for a surgery date. That surgery is postponed. Not because the doctor is unavailable, not because the hospital is full, because there is not enough power to run the operating room reliably. This is what a fuel blockade does to a civilian population. It does not just turn off the lights, and it turns off the hospital, it turns off the refrigerator where insulin is stored, it turns off the water pump, it turns off the traffic signal, it turns off the fan that keeps an elderly person alive in tropical heat, and protests are erupting. Over the weekend, demonstrators in Cuba torched a Communist Party office. This is significant because public protest in Cuba is rare and dangerous. People are angry enough now to take that risk. The conditions, as Al Jazeera reported, have fomented rare public unrest. Now here's where it gets complicated, and I want you to pay attention to this part carefully. The Trump administration is watching those protests. Trump said on Monday, while Cuba was still dark, that Cuba is a failed nation and that a deal was coming, either through negotiation or through, quote, "and faction katua chalver nayasara," down whatever we have to do. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants and a longtime supporter of regime change in Cuba, has been leading the diplomatic pressure. He met secretly with a Cuban government representative last month in St. Kitts and Nevis. Cuba has agreed in preliminary talks to release 51 political prisoners. So here's the shape of what is happening. The U.S. cuts off Cuba's oil. Cuba's grid collapses. Civilians suffer. Protests start. Cuba comes to the table. The U.S. says make a deal or face more pressure. That is not diplomacy. That is coercion through civilian suffering. And the U.S. government has been transparent enough about the goal, regime change in Cuba by the end of 2026, that you do not have to speculate. It is stated policy. Democratic Senators Tim Kaine, Adam Schiff, and Ruben Gallego have filed a war powers resolution on Cuba. Senator Ed Markey posted that Trump's vindictive oil embargo is depriving innocent Cuban citizens of basic necessities and creating a humanitarian crisis. The UN called it a serious violation of international law, and yet it is barely making the front page because the Iran war is consuming all the oxygen in the room. If you think the Cuba story deserves more coverage than it is getting, if you think using civilian hunger and darkness as a negotiating tool is something people should be talking about loudly, share this video. Because this story is being buried under everything else happening right now. Here's the angle I think almost nobody is stating plainly enough. Cuba and Iran are not two separate stories. They are the same story told in two different theaters. In both cases, the United States is using energy as a weapon against a civilian population to force a government to change its behavior or collapse entirely. In Iran, the goal was to destroy military and nuclear capability. In Cuba, the goal is regime change. The tools are different, bombs in one case, blockade in the other. But the logic is identical. Control the energy, control the people, force the government's hand, and in both cases, the people who suffer first and most are not the people making the political decisions. They are the elderly woman who cannot keep her soup cold. They are the patient whose surgery is postponed. They are the child studying by candlelight for the third night in a row. There's a pattern here that the Center for Strategic and International Studies has documented across multiple U.S. foreign policy episodes. When the U.S. imposes severe economic pressure on a country, the government rarely collapses quickly. What happens instead is that ordinary people suffer for a prolonged period while the government uses that suffering as a rallying point for national solidarity. The Cuban government is doing exactly that, framing the blackout as the result of American aggression, not government failure. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The U.S. blockade is creating the very suffering it says it wants to end. And Trump offering a deal while the lights are off is not generosity. It is leverage. It is saying, sign here or stay in the dark. The math does not lie. Cuba has not received oil for over 3 months. The UN warned it would collapse. It collapsed. Exactly as predicted. The question is not whether this was foreseeable. It was foreseen and documented in real time. The question is whether deliberately engineering a humanitarian crisis to force political change is something that should be accepted as normal foreign policy. Yes or no? That is what I want from you in the comments before we move forward. Do you believe that cutting off oil to an entire civilian population, causing hospital shutdowns, food spoilage, and island-wide blackouts is an acceptable tool of foreign policy? Yes or no? Because the answer to that question is not a partisan one. It is a moral one, and it deserves a direct answer. Let me show you the pattern one more time, because it matters. The United States has used economic pressure, sanctions, blockades, embargoes, as a foreign policy tool for decades. Cuba has been under some form of U.S. embargo since 1962, and that is 64 years. Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Syria, the list is long, and in almost every case, the stated goal is to pressure a government into changing its behavior or stepping down. Here is what the evidence consistently shows. Governments rarely collapse quickly under sanctions. What happens instead is that ordinary people absorb enormous suffering while the political leadership adapts, finds workarounds, or uses the external pressure to consolidate domestic support. Cuba's government has survived 64 years of U.S. pressure. The blackout did not come from political failure. It came from an engineered fuel shortage. And the people living through it are not the ones who chose Cuba's political system. What this story reveals about power is simple and uncomfortable. When a powerful country decides to use energy as a weapon against a weaker one, there are no precision strikes. The hospital cannot be protected from a fuel blockade. The 71-year-old woman's refrigerator cannot be shielded from a grid collapse. The patient waiting for surgery cannot opt out of the consequences of geopolitics. The UN Secretary General called it an emergency. UN human rights experts called it a serious violation of international law. Democratic senators are filing war powers resolutions, and Trump said Cuba was a failed nation and that a deal was coming. There is something deeply worth examining in that framing. Calling Cuba a failed nation while the U.S. controls whether or not oil reaches the island is like turning off someone's oxygen and then describing them as unhealthy. The failure is not organic, it is engineered. Meanwhile, the Iran war rages. Russia strikes Ukraine while U.S. diplomatic attention is elsewhere. Pakistan struck a hospital in Afghanistan. The Mediterranean is seeing its deadliest start to any year for people trying to cross it. The world has multiple simultaneous crises unfolding, and the media can only focus on one or two at a time. Cuba's 11 million people are in the dark, literally, and the world is mostly looking the other way. Follow the power, follow the darkness, and ask the question that gets asked too rarely when it comes to U.S. foreign policy towards smaller, weaker nations. Who decided these people should suffer? And what did they do to deserve it? Mercedes Velasquez is still waiting to see what happens. Her soup spoiled, the lights are still not fully back, the surgeries are still postponed, and somewhere in Washington, and someone is calling this leverage. 11 million people, third blackout in 4 months, 3 months without oil, and a U.S. president saying a deal is coming after Rubio is finished with Iran. The question that Cuba's darkness leaves hanging in the air tonight, the one that should follow every decision like this one. At what point does using civilian suffering as a negotiating tool stop being foreign policy and start being something that needs a different name entirely?